Most people pray to a God they believe exists somewhere out there, begging for intervention in their problems. Joel Goldsmith discovered this approach keeps you spiritually powerless because you're addressing an external deity who may or may not respond to your requests. The revolutionary truth Goldsmith uncovered will shatter your current religious conditioning. God is not a being separate from you. God is the very consciousness that you are. This isn't blasphemy. It's the mystical reality that transforms everything about how you experience life. When you realize that divine consciousness is your true identity, prayer becomes communion with your own spiritual nature. You stop begging an outside force and start recognizing the infinite power that has always been operating as your very being. This understanding changed Goldsmith from a traditional religious teacher into a mystical healer who could demonstrate instantaneous spiritual healing. The same consciousness breakthrough awaits you right now. Traditional religion taught Goldsmith that God judges, punishes, and rewards based on human behavior. He spent years preaching this conventional approach until a profound spiritual awakening revealed the opposite truth about divine nature and human experience. God doesn't operate in the realm of good and evil, reward and punishment. Divine consciousness simply is, expressing as wholeness, completeness, and perfection. Disease, lack, and suffering exist only in human mental concepts, not in spiritual reality. This revelation came during Goldsmith's deepest spiritual crisis, when traditional prayers failed completely. In that moment of surrender, he experienced God not as external judge, but as the very life force expressing through every cell of his being. From that breakthrough forward, Goldsmith's healing work demonstrated that consciousness creates experience. Change your level of consciousness and your external circumstances transform automatically without human effort or manipulation. Goldsmith discovered that most spiritual seekers unknowingly practice spiritual materialism, using spiritual techniques to get material results from a God they imagine controls external circumstances like a cosmic vending machine. This approach keeps you trapped in limitation because you're still operating from the belief that something outside yourself has power over your experience. You remain spiritually dependent and mentally frustrated when prayers aren't answered according to your timeline. True spiritual practice involves recognizing that consciousness and experience are one unified movement. There is no separation between your awareness and what appears in your life. Everything you experience is consciousness appearing as form, circumstance, and relationship. When you grasp this non-dual reality, manipulation stops and authentic spiritual living begins. You no longer try to change conditions through willpower or positive thinking, but rest in the awareness that consciousness itself is the substance and activity of all experience. The most radical discovery in Goldsmith's teaching is this: there is no human being who needs healing, improvement, or spiritual development. Your true identity is already complete, whole, and perfect, because you are divine consciousness itself appearing as individual expression. Every problem you face exists only in the realm of mental concepts about yourself and your circumstances. When you recognize your true identity as consciousness, these mental images lose their power to create suffering, limitation, and discord in your experience. This doesn't mean ignoring practical responsibilities or denying challenging circumstances. It means recognizing that your essential nature remains untouched by temporary appearances. You begin responding to life from wholeness rather than reacting from imagined lack. Goldsmith proved this understanding through decades of spiritual healing work. When people recognized their true identity as divine consciousness, physical healing, financial abundance, and relationship harmony often followed naturally without human intervention or effort. During World War II, Goldsmith was stationed in the Pacific, where he witnessed the healing power of consciousness recognition firsthand. A fellow soldier approached him with severe dysentery that military doctors couldn't cure through conventional medical treatment. Instead of praying to God for healing, Goldsmith helped the soldier recognize that his true identity as divine consciousness was incapable of disease or disorder. They spent 3 days in silent communion with this spiritual truth about identity and wholeness. On the third day, the soldier experienced complete healing without any medical intervention. The dysentery disappeared entirely because consciousness had been lifted above the mental concepts that were projecting the appearance of physical disorder and limitation. Word spread throughout the military base about this remarkable healing. Over the following weeks, dozens of soldiers sought Goldsmith's help for various ailments. Most experienced significant improvement when they grasped their identity as divine consciousness expressing perfect health. After the war, a wealthy businessman contacted Goldsmith about financial ruin, threatening his family's security and future prosperity. Traditional business solutions had failed completely, and bankruptcy seemed inevitable within weeks of their initial meeting. Goldsmith explained that financial lack exists only in human mental concepts about limitation, scarcity, and separation from infinite abundance. Divine consciousness knows only wholeness, completeness, and unlimited supply, because these qualities define the very nature of spiritual reality. Together, they practiced recognizing consciousness as the substance and activity of all supply. Instead of using mental techniques or positive affirmations, they rested in silent awareness of abundance as consciousness expressing through every aspect of experience. Within 2 months, unexpected opportunities began emerging that resolved the financial crisis completely. New business partnerships formed, old debts were forgiven, and profitable ventures appeared naturally without forced effort or manipulation on the businessman's part. A mother brought her teenage daughter to Goldsmith after medical specialists declared her condition incurable and progressive. The family had exhausted conventional treatments and alternative therapies without any improvement in symptoms or overall health. Rather than focusing on the physical condition, Goldsmith guided them to recognize that divine consciousness expresses only perfection, wholeness, and harmony. Disease and disorder exist solely in human mental concepts about body, health, and physical limitation. The breakthrough came when the daughter experienced a profound recognition of her true identity as perfect spiritual expression. This wasn't positive thinking or mental denial of symptoms, but authentic spiritual realization of consciousness as the substance of her being. Gradual improvement began within weeks of this recognition. Over 6 months, symptoms diminished steadily until medical examination revealed complete restoration of normal function. The healing occurred naturally as consciousness recognition dissolved the mental concepts, creating disease appearance. These transformation stories reveal the practical power of consciousness recognition in everyday human experience. When you stop seeking healing from outside sources and recognize wholeness as your true identity, apparent problems lose their power to create suffering and limitation. Goldsmith's approach differs from positive thinking, visualization, or mental manipulation techniques. You're not trying to change circumstances through mental effort, but recognizing that consciousness and experience are unified spiritual movement, expressing perfect harmony. This understanding requires patience and consistent practice because lifetime conditioning has programmed human thinking to believe in separation, limitation, and external causation. Spiritual awakening is a gradual process of recognition rather than sudden magical transformation. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. What healing journey resonated most with you? Beyond recognition of your true identity, Goldsmith taught practical techniques for maintaining consciousness awareness throughout daily activities. The most powerful practice he discovered was what he called spiritual listening, silent receptivity to divine guidance rather than mental planning. Instead of beginning each day with personal goals and mental strategies, spend 15 minutes in complete silence, allowing consciousness to reveal its own perfect activity. This receptive state opens you to guidance that transcends human knowledge and planning. During this listening period, don't attempt to hear voices or receive dramatic revelations. Simply rest in quiet awareness, allowing whatever thoughts, feelings, or insights to arise naturally without judgment or interpretation from your personal mind. This practice gradually establishes a continuous sense of being guided by infinite intelligence rather than struggling through life with limited human perspective. Decisions become clearer, timing improves, and opportunities appear more synchronistically. Another essential technique Goldsmith developed was consciousness treatment for challenging relationships and difficult people. Instead of trying to change other people's behavior or protect yourself from their negativity, you work entirely within your own consciousness recognition. When facing relationship conflict, silently recognize that the other person's true identity is divine consciousness, expressing perfection and harmony. Their troublesome behavior exists only in mental concepts, not in their essential spiritual nature. This practice doesn't make you passive or vulnerable to abuse. Rather than reacting emotionally or defending your personal position, you respond from spiritual understanding that dissolution of conflict comes through consciousness recognition rather than human argument. Many students report that difficult relationships transform naturally when they consistently practice seeing others as consciousness rather than problematic personalities. Harmony emerges without confrontation or manipulation because consciousness recognizes itself as the essence of every individual. For abundance and supply concerns, Goldsmith taught consciousness recognition rather than mental techniques or positive affirmations about money and material possessions. Abundance isn't something you attract or create through spiritual manipulation of external circumstances. Divine consciousness is infinite supply itself, expressing through every aspect of your experience, including finances, resources, opportunities, and material needs. Lack exists only in mental concepts about limitation and separation from this infinite abundance. Practice recognizing consciousness as the substance and activity of all supply in your experience. This means acknowledging abundance not as something you need to acquire, but as the very nature of consciousness expressing through your daily needs and activities. Students often discover that supply appears more naturally when they stop trying to demonstrate abundance and simply rest in recognition of consciousness as unlimited supply. Opportunities, resources, and financial solutions emerge without forced effort or anxiety about material security. The most advanced technique Goldsmith shared was consciousness recognition during physical pain or illness symptoms. Instead of fighting disease or using spiritual techniques to overcome physical problems, you recognize wholeness as the truth about embodied existence. Physical healing occurs naturally when consciousness is recognized as the substance and activity of bodily experience. Disease symptoms exist in mental concepts about body, aging, heredity, and physical vulnerability, not in consciousness expressing as perfect embodiment. This approach requires great patience and spiritual maturity, because human conditioning strongly believes in physical causation and medical necessity. Consciousness healing works gradually, as mental concepts about limitation dissolve through consistent recognition of spiritual wholeness. Many students experience significant health improvements through this practice, though Goldsmith always emphasized that consciousness recognition supplements rather than replaces appropriate medical care when needed for immediate physical safety and comfort. Despite these powerful techniques, most students encounter significant obstacles when applying consciousness recognition to deeply rooted problems and lifelong patterns of limitation, fear, and suffering that resist spiritual understanding and healing approaches. The greatest challenge is mental resistance to accepting your true identity as divine consciousness. Human conditioning insists on personal identity, individual problems, and external causation. Your mind will generate countless arguments against spiritual truth. Another common obstacle is expecting immediate results from consciousness recognition. Spiritual awakening is usually gradual, requiring consistent practice over months or years as lifetime conditioning slowly dissolves through repeated recognition of truth about identity and experience. Many students become discouraged when old patterns resurface after initial breakthrough experiences. This is normal spiritual development, not failure. Each recognition of consciousness deepens understanding and weakens the hold of limiting mental concepts over your experience. When consciousness recognition seems ineffective, Goldsmith recommended examining your motivation for spiritual practice. Are you using spiritual techniques to improve your human experience, or genuinely seeking recognition of your true identity as divine consciousness itself? Spiritual materialism, using consciousness techniques to get better human circumstances, keeps you trapped in the very dualistic thinking that creates problems. True spiritual practice involves surrendering personal goals for the sake of consciousness recognition, regardless of external results. This doesn't mean becoming passive about practical responsibilities or ignoring legitimate human needs. It means approaching life's challenges from recognition of wholeness rather than reacting from concepts of personal inadequacy, limitation, or separation from supply and guidance. The shift from spiritual materialism to authentic recognition is subtle, but transformative. When you stop trying to use consciousness and instead recognize consciousness as your true identity, genuine spiritual living begins naturally, without effort or manipulation. Physical healing challenges often persist despite sincere consciousness recognition, because deep-rooted beliefs about heredity, aging, and physical vulnerability continue operating beneath conscious awareness, creating continued experience of limitation and disorder. Goldsmith discovered that emotional healing frequently requires addressing ancestral patterns and family conditioning that created fundamental beliefs about identity, worthiness, and life possibilities. These inherited mental concepts influence experience even when consciously rejected or spiritually understood. The solution isn't psychological analysis or emotional processing, but deeper recognition that consciousness has no family history, genetic inheritance, or emotional baggage from the past. Your true identity remains eternally fresh, complete, and uncontaminated by human generational patterns. This level of consciousness recognition requires tremendous spiritual courage because it means releasing identification with personal history, family identity, and psychological explanations for current limitations. Freedom comes through recognizing yourself as pure consciousness without historical conditioning. When relationship healing seems impossible despite consciousness recognition, the obstacle is usually attachment to others changing their behavior to meet your emotional needs and expectations. You're still operating from personal identity, seeking satisfaction from external sources. True relationship harmony emerges when you recognize others as consciousness rather than personalities who should behave according to your preferences. This requires releasing your agenda for how relationships should unfold and allowing consciousness to express its own perfect harmony. This practice is particularly challenging with family members and intimate partners where emotional patterns run deep. Recognition of consciousness doesn't eliminate appropriate boundaries or healthy relationship standards, but shifts your motivation from personal need to spiritual recognition. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment. Which obstacle are you ready to transform now? Advanced practitioners learn to maintain consciousness recognition during intense life transitions, such as career changes, relationship endings, health crises, and financial upheavals, when spiritual understanding faces its greatest tests through challenging circumstances. During his own experience of professional transition from traditional ministry to mystical teaching, Goldsmith faced severe criticism from religious authorities and loss of financial security. Consciousness recognition sustained him through years of uncertainty about life direction. He discovered that major life transitions often represent consciousness, calling you to deeper levels of spiritual understanding. What appears as external disruption is actually consciousness dissolving limiting structures that no longer serve your spiritual evolution and authentic expression. Advanced practice involves welcoming transitions as consciousness expanding into greater freedom rather than problems to be solved or difficulties to endure. This perspective transforms crisis into opportunity for deeper recognition of your unlimited spiritual nature. In business and professional activities, consciousness recognition creates an entirely different approach to success, competition, and material achievement. Instead of struggling against others or forcing outcomes through personal will, you allow consciousness to express its own perfect activity. Goldsmith worked with numerous business leaders who discovered that consciousness recognition actually enhanced professional effectiveness rather than making them passive or impractical. Intuitive guidance improved decision-making, and authentic leadership emerged naturally from spiritual understanding. This doesn't mean avoiding practical skills or professional development, but approaching career activities from consciousness rather than personal ambition or fear of failure. Work becomes an expression of consciousness rather than a source of identity or security. Students often report that professional opportunities expand naturally when they stop trying to manipulate career outcomes and trust consciousness to express its perfect activity through their skills, talents, and service to others. Parenting from consciousness recognition transforms family relationships by recognizing children as complete spiritual beings rather than incomplete humans requiring improvement, correction, or constant guidance from adult authority figures who know better about life direction. This approach doesn't eliminate appropriate discipline or practical guidance. but shifts the foundation from control-based parenting to recognition-based relationship. You respond to children from their wholeness rather than reacting to behavioral problems or developmental concerns. Goldsmith emphasized that children are often naturally closer to consciousness recognition than adults because they haven't yet accumulated layers of mental conditioning about limitation, separation, and personal inadequacy that complicate spiritual understanding and authentic expression. Many parents discover that behavioral problems resolve naturally when they consistently recognize their children's true identity as divine consciousness, rather than trying to fix personality issues or force better behavior through reward and punishment systems. Aging and physical decline become opportunities for deeper consciousness recognition rather than inevitable deterioration to fear and resist. Goldsmith maintained vitality and mental clarity well into his 70s through consistent recognition of consciousness as timeless, ageless essence. The mental concepts that create aging experience include beliefs about physical decline, reduced capacity, approaching death, and loss of relevance as life progresses. These concepts exist in human thinking, not in consciousness, which remains eternally fresh and unlimited. This doesn't mean denying the practical realities of physical changes or avoiding appropriate health care, but recognizing that your essential identity remains unaffected by temporal changes in bodily appearance and physical capacity. Students often report increased energy and improved health when they stop identifying with aging concepts and consistently recognize consciousness as the ageless substance of their being. Physical improvements often follow naturally without forced effort to reverse aging process. Death loses its terror when understood as the dissolution of mental concepts, rather than the ending of consciousness. Goldsmith's final years demonstrated complete peace about transitional processes because he recognized consciousness as eternal, indestructible spiritual reality. This understanding transforms grief and loss by recognizing that consciousness cannot be destroyed or separated. What appears as death is simply the release of limiting concepts that temporarily obscured recognition of eternal spiritual identity. Fear of death creates much human suffering and drives desperate attempts to extend physical life or achieve immortality through material means. Recognition of consciousness as your true identity resolves death anxiety naturally without denial or spiritual bypassing. Many students report profound peace about mortality questions when they deeply recognize consciousness as their essential nature. This recognition doesn't eliminate natural sadness about loss, but removes the terror that often accompanies thoughts about physical death. Global challenges such as war, environmental destruction, and social injustice appear differently from consciousness recognition. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by world problems or politically divided about solutions, you recognize consciousness as the only true power operating. This doesn't create passive indifference to human suffering or social responsibility, but establishes spiritual foundation for effective action. When you respond to global challenges from consciousness rather than personal outrage or political ideology, your contribution becomes more unified and healing. Goldsmith taught that consciousness recognition by even small numbers of people creates invisible spiritual influence that contributes to planetary harmony and peace. Individual spiritual understanding has collective impact beyond immediate personal circles. Students often discover that their social and environmental concerns are addressed more effectively when approached from consciousness recognition rather than emotional reaction or political activism based on mental concepts about good and evil forces. Teaching and sharing consciousness recognition requires great spiritual maturity because you must resist the temptation to convert others or prove spiritual truth through argument, demonstration, or personal persuasion that creates spiritual pride and mental confusion. Goldsmith emphasized that consciousness recognition cannot be taught through intellectual explanation or emotional inspiration. It must be recognized individually through direct spiritual experience that transcends mental understanding and emotional conviction about truth. Your role is simply to live from consciousness recognition and allow others to recognize truth for themselves when they are spiritually ready. Forcing spiritual understanding on others actually interferes with their natural awakening process and creates resistance. The most effective spiritual teaching occurs through silent recognition of others' true identity as consciousness rather than verbal instruction or demonstration. This creates spiritual atmosphere where recognition can emerge naturally without personal interference or manipulation. Your entire understanding of God is now transformed from external deity to recognized consciousness, expressing as your very being. This recognition dissolves the separation that created every limitation, problem, and spiritual seeking in your experience throughout life. Prayer becomes communion with your own divine nature, rather than petitioning outside authority. Healing emerges through recognition of wholeness rather than treatment of problems. Abundance flows as consciousness expressing supply rather than acquisition of material possessions. This isn't the end of your spiritual journey, but the beginning of authentic spiritual living. Every day offers opportunities to deepen recognition and discover new dimensions of consciousness expressing through relationships, activities, and circumstances. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path.